Hello, and welcome again. In this last section of our presentation on gender, I want to talk about um, some of the ways in which gender intersects with practices of violence, with the transformation of political societies into the nationally defined form that they claim to take after the 1990s, and also try to make some general observations about issues of gender that are unique or relatively unique to the region that we're studying. So let's talk about violence. Uh, Look, in the context of war and violence, I mean, you already saw that nationalist rhetoric promotes images of gender, the warrior image for men, the mother image for women, and so forth. These are rhetorical images. It does not follow from the fact that these images were promoted that there were changes in the ways that people lived their lives or understood themselves. What follows from it is that there are some versions of gender identity that were relatively more socially approved and that were affirmed through political institutions, through media, and through other sources. Now, I bring this up in the context of research by Sasha Milicevic. She is a sociologist who studied comparatively two groups in Serbia. One group was people, there was a large number of them, men, who avoided calls for military service. About 40% of people who received calls for military service during the wars of the 1990s refused those calls and then spent a long time escaping enforcement of calls to military service. And the other group were people who volunteered for service. They volunteered either for formal military units or for paramilitary units that were in large measure armed and financed by the state, usually in a covert way. And let's concentrate for a moment on the volunteers, the people who volunteered for military and paramilitary units. So she has sets of interviews with them. One current that comes through these interviews with the volunteers is that the people who volunteered had varying reasons for doing it. Some of them were doing it because it was consistent with their political beliefs, with their belief that this was a way of defending the interests of the nation, of protecting people against threat and so on. But another thing that they had in common is that these were people who lived in circumstances that made it difficult for them to realize the idealized form of male identity that was being promoted through media and through institutions of the state. They were unemployed and had domestic partners who were employed, or they were employed but were earning less than these domestic partners, or they were in domestic power relationships that were not consistent with the promoted gender ideal. And in this case, volunteering for military or in some cases paramilitary service became a way of compensating for this dissonance between the ideal of gender identity that was promoted and the ways in which they were living their lives. It became a way of finding routes to achieve the gender identity that was promoted. And I don't say that this is directly connected in every respect, but it is also not unconnected to the frequency with which sexual violence was committed as a part of military and especially paramilitary activity during the conduct of the war. There was a very, very high incidence of sexual violence in the war. Whether it is higher or lower than in other armed conflicts, we cannot say for sure because records are not kept in every armed conflict. But we know that the conduct of it was programmatic, and that the practice of it was often connected to different forms of gendered national images and stereotypes. So this may also be connected to the concrete difficulties that people encountered in living out the gender identities that were promoted, and then the use of these temporary positions of power over other people that are created by violence in order to perform these roles, in particular roles of unequal power. But it is because of this, look, that on the local level and partly because of the effects of sexual violence, partly because of the kind of victimization that was created, and the result of the violence in leaving a lot of victims who were women whose male family members had been killed, injured, disappeared, deported in times of war, that in the post-war environment you see gender used as a basis for the articulation of demands, either demands to recognize the unique experience of different gender groups related to violence, or demands for forms of assistance and compensation that would be directed in ways that are of interest to particular genders. And you see ways in which gender identities are used as a pretext and a justification for demands related to post-conflict needs. All of this falls into a larger global pattern described by the political scientist Cynthia Enloe, who talks about the effects of environments becoming militarized, of the presence of a large military element in a social environment, a military base or military operations. You see an increase in different types of gender-defined activities, and these are activities that will include prostitution and gender-related violence not connected to conflict. So the general point here is that the atmosphere of violence intersects with ideas that are being promoted by gender in ways that are in some ways constitutive of violence, and in some ways are constitutive of demands that derive from the experience of violence. Now, let's go from the specific to the general and talk about some broader things that we can say about gender and the experience of gender and gender inequality in the region. First, let's go back to that framework that we proposed at the beginning of the first segment of this presentation, that there are so-called traditional roles that are detraditionalized as part of the experience of modernization and also partly as part of a political project, and then retraditionalized in the contemporary period where identity-based demands become more important. The big question that we want to raise about this image of retraditionalization is there a re there? Is there something there that is trying to recapture older experiences of gender and gender identities that can be traced to tradition, or are new forms of inequality being proposed that derive from new conditions that have been created on the ground? So what we want to do is look at this new gender situation and ask, is it going backward into something that is already known, or is it going forward into something that is not an advance of causes of equality or anything like that, but represents possibly something new? One of the ways in which we can look at this, and we're going to look at this in more detail next week when our topic is going to be popular culture, is to look at the forms of sexuality and performance and display of sexuality that are promoted through popular culture representations. I've described this here in the slide as turbo folk sexuality, that is as a particular style of projection of sexual identity and sexual orientation that is promoted through a form of popular music that is widespread throughout the region. But this is going to be familiar to any of you who are familiar with forms of display in popular music, a kind of caricatured form of sexuality and display. Now, here's what I would argue: there is a lot that can be said about this form of display that's apparent in turbo folk sexuality. Certainly a lot of people describe it as a kind of heightened form of objectification, as a performance of subjection, as a reduction of the person into an object of contemplation, desire, whatever, it's possible to come up with an alternative reading to say that the display of heightened and foregrounded forms of sexuality and sexual identity through this kind of performance can also be a representation of a kind of power, of a kind of autonomy, of control over the performer's own sexual identity and of images of identity. People have used different terms for this. One of the terms that I like is the people who describe this kind of display as representing libidinal entrepreneurship. What I'd argue, though, is that there is one thing that you cannot say about these forms of display, and that is that they are representations of traditional understandings of sexuality that are typical of rural life, the village, and the agricultural form of activity. They are in fact characteristic of the contemporary period in which they are produced, which leads us then again to a broader question. What can we say generally about gender and gender identities and disputes over gender in contemporary Southeast Europe? Maybe we can say this, that the conflicts that are apparent, the dilemmas that are apparent, the disputes that are visible, look broadly similar to the way that they look everywhere else in the world. There is a similar set of issues, but because of insecurity, isolation, conflict, scarcity, because of a unique set of political conditions and ideological forms that are emerging and have become dominant in the region, they are subject to more severe constraints, and the lines of division become starker and more apparent. But this is a suggestion that may or may not be right. I'll look forward to discussing it with you when we have our live session.